Good evening. My name is Jesús Castro-Balbi, and I serve as the director of the Dr. Bobby Bailey School of Music. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening into our beautiful space here at the Bailey Performance Center. This is a very special evening in which we commemorate the events of Kristallnacht. I think you will hear the experts talk about Kristallnacht, so I'm not going to venture there. But I would say that Kristallnacht was a turning point for many people in many ways, including in this country, including in academia. Kristallnacht is the point where American academia started really embracing immigrants from Germany and from Europe in general. And so it's very significant on many levels. I also like to thank our partners. As we tell the story through music, we will also tonight have the pleasure of hearing the commentary. So tonight we welcome Dr. Catherine Lewis from the Museum Archives and Rare Books, and we also welcome Adina Langer from the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. We also have the pleasure to welcome Rabbi Joseph Prass from the Weinberg Center for Holocaust Education at the Breman Museum. I would like to take a moment to also celebrate that we are featuring our faculty this evening. We'll have the pleasure to hear Dr. Munson, Judith Call, and also we'll have the pleasure to end with our own students. So I know you will enjoy hearing the KSU chamber singers. In a couple of days, they will record Fugitive Footsteps, and so this is very, very important for them to have the experience to play it before live audience. And naturally, I'd like to give huge thanks to Dr. Laurence Sherr for organizing this event. He's a true mastermind of this event, and we are so grateful for everything he does here, and including this event. And lastly, if there are any survivors of the Holocaust, I'd like to ask you to please signal, maybe raise your hands or stand up. So I would say it is all the more important that we continue to tell the story. So I would thank you so much for being here this evening.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Catherine Lewis. I'm the AVP for Museums, Archives, and Rare Books at Kennesaw State University, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. We're delighted to be partners this evening, and we have so many wonderful partners with us, of course, the Breman Museum, the College of the Arts, the School of Music. So I'm also a historian, and my job tonight is to put Kristallnacht in historical context. So step back in time with me for a moment. On the night of November 8th, 1938, exactly 83 years ago, violent anti-Jewish pogroms broke out across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, which was a region in Czechoslovakia. Nazi officials depicted these riots as justified as a response to the assassination of a German foreign official by a 17-year-old Polish Jew who was distraught over the deportation of his family from Germany. For the next 48 hours, violent mobs, spurred on by anti-Semitic exhortations from Nazi officials, destroyed hundreds of synagogues, burning and desecrating Jewish religious artifacts along the way. Acting on orders from the Gestapo headquarters, police officers and firefighters did nothing to prevent the destruction. When the pogrom finally ended, 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and schools were destroyed, and 91 Jews were murdered. Nazi officials immediately claimed that the Jews themselves were to blame for the riots, and a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks was levied against the Jewish community. The Nazis came to call this event Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, the night of broken glass, referring to the thousands of shattered windows that littered the streets afterwards. But that euphemism does not convey the brutality of the event, as you'll see with some of these photographs. After Kristallnacht, more than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, all concentration camps in Germany that were constructed to hold Jews, political prisoners, and other enemies of the Nazi state. After these attacks, President Franklin D. Roosevelt expressed his shock that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization. He summoned the U.S. ambassador, Hugh Wilson, home for consultation, and the U.S. did not have an ambassador in Germany again until after the war. FDR also canceled the expiration for between 12,000 and 15,000 Germans traveling in the United States on temporary visas, which meant that they could stay in the United States rather than return to Europe. In the following 10 months, 115,000 Jews immigrated from the Third Reich. Now, Kristallnacht marked a turning point toward a more violent and repressive treatment of Jews by the Nazis. And by the end of 1938, Jews were prohibited from attending school and from being in public places. These conditions only continued to worsen. During World War II, Hitler and the Nazis implemented the final solution to what they referred to as the Jewish problem and carried out a systematic murder of some 6 million European Jews, along with 5 million other groups that were deemed undesirable in what came to be known as the Holocaust. Tonight, we remember those who witnessed and perished in this terrible moment in history through one of the most powerful vehicles we have, music. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Adina Langer, and as the curator of the Museum of History and Holocaust Education here at KSU, I'm delighted to share with you the connections between this evening's performance and our newest traveling exhibit, Words, Music, Memory, representing voices of the Holocaust. The exhibit, which you saw on display out in the atrium, focuses on words in the form of poetry, memoir, and diary entries written by people who experienced the Holocaust. The gallery guide that you see here and can access using your web browser or mobile device highlights links along the chain of commemoration that connects the past and the present. These links include the artists, composers, performers, and producers who have chosen to interpret the words of these writers for you, the audience, to engage with in a new way. The exhibit was conceived in partnership with soprano Sheena Ramirez, a DMA candidate at James Madison University, who planned and programmed a concert to mark the exhibit opening that occurred on September 19th. That concert featured compositions from 2 living composers, Lori Laitman and Dr. Laurence Sherr. In addition to compositions by those 2 composers, the concert you are about to witness also includes an aria by a 3rd living composer featured in the exhibit, Jake Heggie. The other pieces that will be performed this evening are in keeping with the exhibit's themes of witness, preservation, translation, interpretation, and performance. As visual art is another important form of interpretation, the exhibit also includes illustrations of the 8 featured writers created by 2 young artists, Julia Guevara and Martha Hemingway. The first piece in tonight's performance is a song based on the poetry of a young Hungarian named Hanna Senes. Although Senes immigrated to Palestine in 1939, she was arrested and executed in Hungary after parachuting into Yugoslavia on a clandestine mission organized by the Zionist military group Palma. Resistance took many forms during the Holocaust. The second song set in tonight's performance is based on the poetry of young boys who published an underground literary magazine in the ghetto of Terezin. In 2010, Lori Laitman set a number of the poems from Vedem to music. In the gallery guide, you can read about Laitman's journey to composing Holocaust music in the section on Selma Meerbaum-Eisinger. Laitman's song cycle based on Eisinger's work, In Sleep, the World is Yours, was featured in the first Words Music Memory concert. Following the song set from Vedem, you will hear 100,000 Stars from the two-act opera Out of Darkness to Remain by composer Jake Heggie. The Atlanta Opera premiered the work in 2016, which combined two previous compositions based on the memoirs of survivors Kristina Javolska and Gad Beck. 100,000 Stars captures Beck's tremendous sense of loss as he remembers his lover, Manfred Lewin, and the vibrant gay community of pre-war Berlin. As you can see here, each section of the Words Music Memory Gallery Guide includes opportunities to engage deeply with the relationships between the words of the writers who witnessed the Holocaust and the songs, operas, and other dramatic works produced based on the words and the lives of the writers. The gallery guide includes interviews with composers, producers, playwrights, and performers, like this one with Jake Heggie and Jean Shear, and this one with Atlanta Opera Artistic Director Tomer Zavulun. The guide also includes opportunities to watch recordings of performances and to share your responses to the ways that artistic commemoration functions in its various forms. After this evening's performance, I suggest that you come back to the gallery guide to learn more. In particular, I recommend reading my interview with Dr. Laurence Sherr, whom you'll hear from a bit later, in the Shmerka Kaczerginski section. In it, he describes how his process for composing Elegy and Vision for solo cello drew him to compose music specifically to commemorate the Holocaust. Then, explore the section on Nelly sax, where you can learn more about Dr. Sherr's process for composing flame language and Fugitive Footsteps. But now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first musicians to the stage.
It is an honor to be here this evening to be part of such a moving program. My name is Rabbi Joe Prass, and I am the director of the Weinberg Center for Holocaust Education at the Breman Museum. For over 25 years, the Breman has been dedicated to educating the public on lessons that can be learned from this dark period of history. In that time, we have welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors to our museum. Every tour of our gallery, The Absence of Humanity, the Holocaust Years, has heard the story of the Holocaust and what happened to 6 million Jews and millions more who fell to the Nazis' genocide. In addition, each visitor not only hears what happened to the Jews as a whole, but they hear how it affected people as individuals. They hear directly from a Holocaust survivor. And many of our survivors witnessed the horrors of Kristallnacht firsthand. This was a night that was seared in their memory. And one treasured survivor who often shared his recollections was Ben Hirsch. Ben was born and lived in Frankfurt. He was the 5th of 7 children of Dr. Hermann Hirsch, a dentist, and Matilda Auerbach Hirsch. Like all our survivors, Ben has vivid memories of that night, and here is his recollection.
I woke up on the morning of November 10, and my oldest brother, Asher, who was a very religious young man, had a habit of getting up in the morning early and going around the corner to the synagogue and opening up the doors for the early services. And that morning he did the same. He got up and he came running back and he said, God, the synagogue's on fire, the synagogue's on fire. And I was 6 years old. And we went to the Friedberger Anlage synagogue, and when we got there, sure enough, flames were spewing out of the windows. It was a building that was built out of steel, concrete, and stone, and it wasn't going to burn down anytime soon. but everything inside was burning. The pews were burning, the cushions were burning, the drapes were burning. And there were hoodlums going in and out with Molotov cocktails, trying to do as much damage as they could. There were policemen in the middle of the street. And we thought at first the policemen were there to protect the public. Not so. They were there to direct traffic away, to make sure nobody got in the way of what was going on. And they were there to protect the hoodlums because they had a job to do. My father got up early that morning and took down the sign that was in front of our house, which said Herman Israel Hirsch. And incidentally, the Israel was not his middle name, but in 1933, when those laws were passed, they said that every Jewish man had to add Israel for a middle name, and every Jewish woman had to add Sarah for a middle name. So he had to have this sign in front of his house where his practice was, with the Star of David on it, which also he had to do, to let people know this is where Jew lives. And so when he heard about what went on the night of Kristallnacht, he got up early that morning and took down the sign. And what he didn't realize was that the house was being watched, was being cased by 3 Gestapos. Later on, about 3-4 hours later, they came to the house to arrest my father. There were 2 soldiers, or they were at least in uniform, and they both had guns, and they both had German police dogs. And the one in charge, he knocked on the door. My mother came to the door. She was holding my baby sister, who was 9 months old. And the man looked at her and he said, "I'm here to see Dr. Hirsch." And my mother, who was brought up never, ever to lie, had made an exception and said, "This is not a good thing." She looked at him straight in the face and said, "Dr. Hirsch is not here, but if you would leave your card, I will see to it that he calls you as soon as he comes in." Well, the man was not amused because he had been casing the house for 3-4 hours. He knew exactly who was in and who was out. So he grabbed my baby sister from my mother's arms, threw her to the floor, pulled out his pistol, pointed at the baby and said, "Now," to my mother, "you have 30 seconds for Dr. Hirsch to appear. If he doesn't come, I shoot the baby first." Then he pointed to my brother, Werner. "He's next." Then he pointed to me. And then he looks at my mother and says, "I will kill all 7 of your children by age, and then I will shoot you." My father, who was hiding in the half basement of the house, heard all this, ran out real quick and gave himself up. And from what I understand, he was taken to Buchenwald concentration camp.
Ben never saw his father again. Commemorations like this one tonight are so important to honor the memories and actions of those who survived and those who did not. But let us now continue with our program with a piece from Ernest Bloch. Bloch was a Swiss-American composer who wrote a number of works on Jewish themes. His composition, titled "From Jewish Life" for cello and piano, was written during his time as director of the Cleveland Institute of Music.
Good evening. I'm Laurence Sherr, the organizer of this event and the composer of the next two works. I'd like to share with you some perspectives on these two compositions, their connection to my family history, and the inspiration of Nellie Sachs for my work. Elegy and Vision, the first work you're going to hear, was commissioned and premiered in connection with an art exhibit at the Carter Presidential Center here in Atlanta. It was written in memory of my brother, Edwin Neal Sherr. The title is meant to indicate not only mourning, but also hope for the future. In the years following the premiere, Elegy and Vision began to be programmed in various Holocaust memorial concerts, and as such, it became an unintentional Holocaust memorial. For this New York City concert, I was asked to speak to the national teleconference audience about the connection of my work to the Holocaust. This led me to research my family history, including the naming of my brother Edwin Sherr for my mother's sister Edith. Edith was murdered at Auschwitz. I would like to share part of that story with you now, especially as how it is related to the two works on our program and how it informs my research and creative work. My mother's family lived in Egelsbach, Germany. She is the older of the two children in this 1937 photo. Following the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and the increasing anti-Semitic persecution, the windows of their store and home in Egelsbach were broken, and on the fence, the words were painted, "A Jew lives here." Following this incident, the family fled to the larger city of Frankfurt. On Kristallnacht, her father Ludwig, for whom I'm named, was arrested and imprisoned in the Buchenwald concentration camp, simply for being Jewish. My mother told me that on that night, she looked out of her apartment window in Frankfurt and saw the flames coming out of the nearby synagogue that was burning. Her family was eventually able to get her father out of Buchenwald by agreeing to leave Germany. At this time, the Nazis still allowed the Jews to emigrate, a situation that was no longer possible a few years later during the genocide of the Final Solution. This January 1936 photo of my mother and her sister was taken the day before my mother was sent to Switzerland on a Kindertransport. The Breman Museum has other wartime photos of my mother on display, and we're so glad that they are here participating this evening. After my mother was sent to the children's home in Switzerland, her family fled to France with transit visas for Bolivia. They were planning to have my mother join them before perhaps fleeing once again. But the day she went to the train station for the journey to join them, the borders were closed, and she was not able to reunite with her family. She told me that this was one of the saddest days of her life, but it is what saved her. Her family was constantly on the run in France. In 1940, her father was captured and sent to the Gurs concentration camp. In the epidemic conditions of the camp, he caught polio, which led to his death. Her mother, Guda, and sister Edith continued to flee, evading the Nazis for 3.5 years. They tried to get to the safety of neutral Switzerland. But they were captured in Valois, France, in October 1943, and sent to the transit camp of Drancy near Paris. Only 8 days later, they were transported to Auschwitz, with 7-year-old Edith, too young, and 47-year-old Judith, too old to be useful as slave laborers. They were likely gassed on their arrival. My participation in the New York City concert I mentioned before, and the research into my family history led to an epiphany. If my composition, Elegy and Vision, was going to be used for Holocaust commemorations, then why not compose works that were intentionally designed to be Holocaust remembrances? This led to research on music and poetry that was associated with the Holocaust and to the writing of Nellie Sachs. When I read the lines, "The pavements of the foreign city were not laid for the music of fugitive footsteps," I immediately imagined music. And the poem containing these words became the source for my first intentional Holocaust memorial, titled Fugitive Footsteps. As Adina Langer shared with us, Sachs' story is featured in the exhibit and gallery guide of our Museum of History and Holocaust Education, and I want to share some highlights here. Nellie Sachs was born to a liberal Jewish family in Berlin. During her youth, she studied music, dance, and literature, and she started writing poetry at age 18. In 1940, after being summoned by the Nazis, she and her mother barely escaped to the neutral country of Sweden. Throughout the war, they lived in poverty in a one-room apartment in this building in Stockholm. Nellie Sachs continued to witness the Holocaust in her poetry. In 1966, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Next slide, please. Nellie Sachs' poetry bears witness to the Holocaust and the tragedy of the Jewish people with words that are also universal, symbolic of the suffering and redemption of all humanity. I find great inspiration in her portrayal, not only of pain and grief, but also of her hope for healing. Following Fugitive Footsteps, I later wrote another work on Sachs' poetry. As Adina Langer mentioned, this work, Flame Language, is also in the gallery guide. In the coming days, the performers this evening will be recording Fugitive Footsteps. Both Fugitive Footsteps and Flame Language will be on a CD of my remembrance music scheduled to be released next year. Since Nellie Sachs and my mother both escaped Germany and survived the Holocaust in neutral European countries, I dedicated Fugitive Footsteps to my mother. It is a tribute to all survivors. To honor these survivors and my own family history, my work as a composer, researcher, and pedagogue seeks to increase Holocaust awareness. Understanding what happened to oppressed and persecuted groups during the Holocaust helps us to understand the suffering of all marginalized groups today. My hope is to contribute to greater understanding, mutual respect, and tolerance in our contemporary international world. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here this evening, those in the auditorium and those joining us online, would you please now welcome Jesús Castro-Balbi to the stage.